Hello, my name is Daniel Nettle. I'm a professor of behavioural science at Newcastle University, and I'm really delighted to be contributing to this workshop. In my short talk today, I'm just going to talk about some sort of take-home messages or some food for thought, really, from the behavioural sciences for pandemic control and prevention, which we might need to think about in the event of future pandemics. So I'll share my screen and get started straight away. I hope you're seeing my title slide there now. The first point I really want to make is perhaps an obvious one, that the course of a pandemic is entirely determined by behaviour. Yes, of course, it's a viral issue. There has to be a contagious virus to start with, but the spread of that virus, the effectiveness of any measures to inhibit the spread, and the uptake of any potential vaccine or treatment is entirely determined by people's behaviour. Do they do what we ask of them? Do they do the right things in the circumstances of the pandemic? And I want to argue that this is a difficult kind of problem. There are certain areas of human behaviour where we just trust that human behaviour will unproblematically sort itself out. For example, people buying butter. We don't generally feel it's very problematic making sure people get the right brand of butter. Why? Because people have really great information. They can go into the shop, they can see the different brands of butter, they can see what they cost. So they're cognitively sophisticated, they have full information in front of them, and they do it many, many times. So they can actually develop learning by doing, that eventually they work out which brand they like and which one is within their budget and which one represents best value given what they want and so on. So choosing butter is something we think is kind of unproblematic, and all the classical assumptions of rational actor models apply pretty well. Everyone's very well informed, everyone can see what the information is, everyone has a chance to do it again and again until they do it in a way that satisfies them. A pandemic's completely different because people are making decisions under huge uncertainty. It's something they can't see, it's something they have very little direct experience of, and you want them to get it right on the first go. You don't want them to say, well, I ignored the lockdown 5 times and on 3 of them I got ill, and gradually learn, because by then it's too late. By then the pandemic has spread exponentially. So you really want them to do things in advance of having good information and of having personal learning by doing. So that's difficult. Moreover, pandemic control poses particular kinds of collective action problems. So these are problems where the private incentives for behaving a certain way are not well aligned with the socially efficient solutions. Now, you might think that's odd. You might think, well, in a pandemic, obviously you have a selfish incentive not to go outside and catch the disease, or to get your vaccine to get yourself protected. But actually, it's not quite so. At the beginning of the pandemic, when it's very small, the chances of me catching it if I go outside to my favorite restaurant are vanishingly small, right? So really, there's not a big private incentive to stay home. However, I don't want the pandemic to get any bigger. So really, in an ideal world, what I would want is everyone else in the country to stay home and not be involved in chains of transmission so that I can enjoy an ordinary life. So I want everyone else to shoulder the costs of preventing the pandemic from growing in size, while I myself, could go about my daily business. So at the beginning, when the disease is rare, there's a collective action problem of that nature. And then later on with vaccines, there's a collective action problem. So at the beginning, when hardly anyone's been vaccinated, there's a strong private incentive to get vaccinated. But by the time 92% of the population have been vaccinated, actually, there's no real incentive for me because I'm relying on the herd immunity brought about by other people. So there's a collective action problem there at the tail end of the pandemic as well. Now, the good news about that is that contrary to various kind of gloomy economic models, humans can solve collective action problems. They do it surprisingly well, with the right conditions being in place, but it's something humans are capable of doing. And humans appear to have an almost Kantian ability to understand, perhaps contra some sort of simple selfish rational actor models, that they shouldn't behave in ways that if everyone else adopted them would result in a social catastrophe. So people can get the message that although your contribution to keeping the pandemic small is a tiny one, you should do it and everyone else should do it as well. It's just like voting, right? So in political science, there's a very similar paradox. The private incentive for becoming well-informed and voting in an election is very, very small, because one vote very rarely makes any difference to the outcome of an election. But people still do it. And they do it, I think, because they understand that if everyone took that view, it would be a social catastrophe, because we would be choosing our leaders at random. So although the private incentive for me to do that is small, people have a kind of moral understanding that they will do, they should do that as long as everyone else does it too. So I think we don't need to be gloomy about our ability to solve collective action problems. But when we think about pandemics, we need to leverage what we know about humans actually, how humans actually solve such problems, to attempt to employ them. Okay. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about some studies of my own, and the idea of moral vigilance. And the idea of moral vigilance is that people tend to assume that everyone else will behave badly when there's collective threat. By the way, I'm sorry about this orange graph. It wasn't supposed to appear till later in the animation. So we're generally pessimistic about how others are going to behave when there's some sort of collective threat going on. We think that everyone else will be terribly selfish, even if we think we ourselves are prepared to follow the rules. We're sort of pessimistic about other people's propensity to do so. And I've been studying this with my colleague, Rebecca Sachs. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of data from a study that we did as it happened back in March or April 2020, just as the pandemic was taking off in the UK. So we asked our participants about a couple of hypothetical societies, one that we described, and then a second one we described and said, and there's an epidemic disease in this society. And we asked people things like, how moral do you expect the members of the society to be? Or how selfish do you expect them to be? And our participants intuited that when there's an epidemic on, so when people are under existential threat, they'll behave much less morally, as the first pair of bars on that left-hand figure, and much more selfishly. So we have this kind of intuitive conception of people that when the chips are down and they're existentially threatened, everyone turns for themselves and is amoral. In that same study, we asked the same question a different way. We said, now think about COVID-19. There seems to be a pandemic coming, and it was just developing at the time we asked this. Do you think that the people around you are going to be basically selfish or basically cooperative? And about 80% of our participants, UK participants here, said the other members of my society are going to be basically selfish in the pandemic. And a smaller number said they thought people would be more or less cooperative. And then we said, is it necessary to control their behavior through punishment? Is that how you're going to maintain the social order in the pandemic? And the preponderance of our participants said yes, their behavior needs to be controlled through punishment. And if you want to follow this up, I've got a blog post and there's a preprint of a paper there that describes this phenomenon. So in general, our sort of intuition is that when the chips are down, there's a pandemic on, everyone's going to be incredibly selfish, and we're going to have to control social order through punishment. And indeed, if you look at popular representations of pandemics, like the film Pandemic, if you haven't seen it, I recommend it, they always predict a breakdown of the social order, right? That's one of the strong intuitions we have. Oh, pandemic, it will be every person for itself. There'll be looting in the shops. There'll be a breakdown of the social order. Now, that hasn't really happened in any major society in this pandemic. In fact, contrary to our pessimistic beliefs about how people will behave, all of the evidence is that many people, when the chips are really down, there's an existential threat, they step up. Solidarity increases, cooperation can increase, within group cooperation at least. And I've put a couple of references on the slide there to studies that found that in different ways in relation to war and famine. Actually, people behave quite well when they believe that there's a collective existential threat, subject to a couple of constraints. So one is, it has to be clear exactly what constitutes behaving well. If it's unclear, what constitutes behaving well, it's a disaster. So clarity of messaging is incredibly important. Early and clear information about what behaving well constitutes. And a lot of the problem in the pandemic is it wasn't clear at different points what it was to behave well and what was necessary. So that has to be clear. And the other thing, and this is the sort of theme of the rest of what I want to say, is descriptive norms really matter. So you have to feel that other people like you are also behaving well, okay? And that's why it's so incredibly damaging if widespread information gets out of other people not complying, or high visibility people not going along with what's needed, or undermining the sense that we're all behaving alike in response to this collective threat. So both the establishment of collective action in a pandemic and its potential unraveling has a lot to do with descriptive norms. And at this point, if it's okay, I'll just take a sidestep to talk about an old study of mine, which I think made this point in a different way quite well. So this was a study of two neighborhoods of one city, a neighborhood that was high in trust and low in crime versus a matched neighborhood that was high in crime and low in trust. So A was high in trust and low in crime, B was high in crime and low in trust. And we allowed participants from these neighborhoods to play a game where there was real money on the table. It was going to go £10 each to members of their neighborhood. But we allowed some players to steal some or all of the £10 that was destined for some of their neighbors. And they were called player one because they were the sort of first mover in this game. And the first thing to say is that in neighborhood A, the high trust neighborhood, the median amount that was stolen from their neighbors in this way was 0. Whereas in neighborhood B, the low trust neighborhood, the median amount was £5. So, you know, half the people stole, or all of the people stole half the money, whichever way you want to look at it. Then we also asked people in each neighborhood a bunch of questions to the effect of how acceptable is it to steal from other people? And how prevalent is it to steal from other people? And the top right panel there shows the mean responses. There's no neighborhood difference in how acceptable people feel it is to steal. In both neighborhoods, people say it's not very acceptable to steal. But the big neighborhood difference is that in neighborhood B, people believe that stealing is prevalent. They believe that although it is unacceptable, it is in fact widespread, not so much in neighborhood A. So neighborhood B, you know, people feel that their neighbors would steal. And then we looked at what in their attitudes, so that is the acceptability and prevalence perceptions that they've given us, what's the relation between that and the amount of pounds they actually stole. And it turns out that the amount you claim that stealing is acceptable does not at all predict how much you steal in this game. So that's the bottom left panel. There's no relationship. People who say it's totally unacceptable to steal still steal all of it sometimes. By contrast, what predicts how much you steal is your perceived prevalence of stealing in your neighborhood. So if you think everyone else in your neighborhood is stealing, you'll steal too, or, you know, on average, that's the case. And I think this is just an illustration of the fact that if you think other people are doing it, you're going to do it. So the moment in a pandemic it becomes widely believed that everyone else is disobeying the rules, then there's going to be an unraveling. Okay, so that's really something that has to be very carefully thought about. The wrong message is, look, we're really punishing the people who are breaking the rules. We've punished 4,000 people this week. Because what does that tell me? It tells me that 4,000 people at least have broken the rules. Instead, what you want to be able to, you want to be saying to people is 58 million people followed the rules this week. You want to be stressing, actually, people are behaving pretty well, and that's what you need to be communicating, because, you know, there's nothing as infectious as other people behaving well. And the flip side of that, there's nothing as infectious as some people visibly behaving badly. And that becomes kind of contagious. So rather than punishing people who violate, you really want to communicate, actually, this is what behaving well constitutes, and pretty much everyone is doing it, and you want kind of high visibility models of that happening. I just want to end by slightly shifting gear. So I think that normativity is an incredibly important force in human decision-making, particularly when people are making decisions under uncertainty about what they're supposed to do in a novel situation. And normativity is very, very important. But there is potentially also a role for causal understanding. There's a big debate in behavioral science about whether the sophistication of human cognition depends on causal understanding. Right? So one school of thought is humans are incredibly smart. Unlike other animals, they have real causal insight into the ways they can act on the world. That's why they've been able to develop things they have. Another view is actually the reasons humans can develop the sophisticated things they do is not to do with their individual ability to causally understand, but due to their ability to culturally transmit particular behavioral patterns and then build on them. And they can often do this without causal understanding. So I'm not going to adjudicate between those two schools of thought today, but I will say that in this public health context, there's some evidence that causal understanding is actually very important to getting people to change their behavior. So in the behavior change literature, it's a kind of commonplace that it's really hard to change people's behavior. You tell them to wash their hands and they still don't wash their hands. You tell them to wear their seatbelts, and they still don't wear their seatbelts. And I'm just going to show you some data from an interesting study that suggests that giving people a causal understanding of why washing your hands is an important thing to do actually has a very dramatic impact, and actually people's behavior can change. So it was behavior on kids in Hong Kong in the context of the SARS-1 epidemic, where there was lots of advice around telling people to wash their hands. And they looked at two interventions with children. One, a kind of standard public health message, teacher delivered session, emphasizing that there's a virus around and that everyone should wash their hands. And surreptitiously, they actually observed there was a snack that needed to be prepared and then served sort of either side of this intervention. And so they were able to look at, did the children wash their hands? And only about 14% did so, both before and critically after the evaluation. So the behavior didn't change, despite having just sat there and heard a thing about how you should wash your hands. People don't wash their hands. The alternative intervention was something called the Think Biology program, which actually tried to teach them causally why you ought to wash your hands, right? That viruses and bacteria are alive and that hand washing is killing. Okay, so there's something that's alive, it's trying to reproduce, and you can kill it by washing your hands thoroughly. So that crucial causal part of the theory, this is you're dealing with a live thing, you can't see it, but it's alive and you need to kill it. Was the key difference between that and the standard intervention. It didn't mention washing your hands any more than the standard intervention, right? It wasn't about telling people over and over again to wash your hands. It was about giving them causal understanding of why hand washing is important. And in the Think Biology condition, they get a big response that actually, over 40% of people are washing their hands post-intervention, despite hand washing having been mentioned no more. So that actually suggests when you have pandemic interventions, allowing people to understand why is it important to get a vaccine? Why is it important to wear a mask? Why is social distancing important? To make them understand the underlying biology and epidemiology of that may actually have a big impact on their propensity to adopt the right behaviors. Okay, I'll just finish up with some take-home messages. Pandemic responses involve collective action problems, so we need to leverage what we know about how humans solve such problems, and sometimes they can. They're fragile, but they can be solved sometimes. Pandemics involve people behaving under existential threat, and we tend to assume that under existential threat everyone behaves amorally, but this could be an exaggerated belief. It could be a belief that we hold for kind of adaptive reasons, which is we want to detect people behaving badly when they do occur, but actually they're quite rare. Many people want to behave well under existential threat. In adopting behaviors, we're very affected by descriptive norms. So who else is doing, what is everyone else doing? Who is doing what? And particularly descriptive norms of people like me. If I see people like me doing something, I'm more likely to do them absent any better information. So that's very important for understanding how information gets communicated and how behaviors spread. And finally, the last example I gave is that public health messages may be potentially made more effective by conveying the right causal understanding. Now, of course, that's hard because you don't know what the right causal understanding is or how to get it across, but it's an important thing that needs to be thought about. So that's it. I hope I've given you some food for thought for the oncoming discussions, and I look forward to any reaction that you might have, and thank you very much for having me.